So we are here at the Coffee with Ken Summit, and we are winding down. We are thrilled to have Madeline Hart of Palantir as our closing speaker, and we're excited to talk about your book, Mobilize. Good to see you.
Well, thanks for having me, Ken. And this is a wonderful inaugural Coffee with Ken Summit.
Appreciate it. So glad you could be here. So we heard from leaders all day today, from government, from finance, from industry. And I think it's appropriate that we ended this conversation in our summit today with you for really a call for us all to come together and, dare we say, mobilize. But share with the group, what should we mobilize for?
So Mobilize came out on March 17th, which was about 3 weeks into the war with Iran. And every other headline was about the munitions crisis and do we have enough munitions on hand? I would say in general, our technology performed very well. We have incredible troops, but clearly there's a problem on the back end with our manufacturing capacity, and we were diverting things from South Korea to be able to support the ongoing conflict, which ultimately lasted around 6 weeks or so. But then the question on everyone's mind is if we were facing a protracted conflict with China or even continued conflict with Iran on multiple fronts, what does U.S. industrial capacity look like? And our defense industrial capacity is really downstream of our broader industrial capacity as a nation commercially. And the book is about how do we bring in the rest of the economy into our industrial base. We cannot afford to have a defense industrial base. It is literally too expensive, and it's also not stimulating the parts of the economy that the average American is looking to see revitalized for manufacturing. And then there's the people aspect, and who are the individuals that we need to make sure have a path to change, and what does it look like to ensure that the bureaucracy is not blocking them, and how can we be inspired by history from past mobilizations during World War II and Cold War, what lessons apply, what's completely different about our moment today, and where we need to be thinking entirely differently.
And I love so much of that because it was so much about history as well. You took the reader through kind of World War II and history and so much of that. But I want to point back at a little bit of the historical context. I was just at the London Defense Conference, and so much of it was kind of a recognition of the role of the United States during World War II. And I think you talk a lot about it in the book, and I'd love for you to amplify it, right? It wasn't a victory of the U.S. military production. It was really U.S. industrial production. And I think it's worth just like you sharing a little bit more about what that was, right? It wasn't that we were already in a position to produce militarily. It was because we had a strong industrial base, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The previous war, World War I, the U.S. actually deployed 0 U.S. designed fighters overseas, and we really struggled to be able to help the Allies. Obviously, it was different than World War II, but in World War I, we were still trying to assist with mass production towards the end, and we actually weren't really able to because we weren't a leader in mass production. The aircraft were literally craft; they weren't designed to be mass produced. And then as World War II comes around, it's much different. The U.S. is a leader in manufacturing globally. We have the auto companies taking a lead there, and there is this big surge to be able to mass produce, but it takes time. It takes about 18 months to get the engine going. And people look back at the 300,000 plus aircraft we produce and tanks and artillery, and lots of commercial companies that have previously never made an artillery shell are now producing at levels that the U.S. Army couldn't even have conceived of. And it wasn't that there wasn't friction. Like Bill Knudsen, who we look back on as the hero from industry of this time, the former Ford and GM exec, he was actually fired and then by FDR, and then FDR kind of allows him to be brought back on as a 3-star general. But there were union strikes. The industry was painted as $1-a-year men because they would go down to Washington, and some of them were just working on like a nominal salary of $1, but still had their ties to industry. They were painted as merchants of death. So there's versions of this debate that we see today as industry is quite involved in the current admin. And I generally think that it's really good because you want the people that are thinking about manufacturing and AI policy to be the ones that have had experience building these things. And so some of the efforts are pretty nascent, like the DOW's Bond Business Operators for National Defense, which is looking to embed industry in the plants of some of the companies that need to surge munitions production. But the tighter that we can be coordinated with not just the specific defense companies, but our broader commercial economy, the better it's going to be.
So talk a little bit about what happened over the last 5-6 decades. Like, how did we lose this kind of strength and positioning that the United States had in industrial production?
Yeah. Well, on the defense side, the process of building and acquiring weapons became much more bureaucratized, and some of that was good. We get things like stealth and mass-produced ICBMs, but the general trend line post-World War II has really been more process. We're looking at 17 years on average to build and deploy a system from the time that you have requirements when it's actually deployed. If you look at what's in Iran or what we use in Iran, the most recent weapon was 15 years old, except for the reverse engineered Shahed, which we copied from the Iranians. But most of those systems were actually like 50 years old. So the requirements really start to stretch out. Robert McNamara, former auto exec who's brought in, he kind of gets a lot of the blame. It's not only his fault, but he does represent the type of managerial personality that was brought in to optimize a system and kind of crush innovation. And some of the kind of whimsy that happens in tech development, where you need to be okay with having some uncertainty as you explore the tech tree. I think this is something that American commercial technology actually understands very well, where not every single effort is going to be successful, but you have to try out some of them. And it's only through experimentation that you get the information that you need to know what isn't going to work. And so during the 60s, we kind of looked back at the 40s and 50s where we had this proliferation of airframes and missiles and said, a lot of that stuff didn't work or this was duplicative. So going forward, we're just going to have the one bomber to rule them all. And it turns out that that was very expensive. It was too hard to define all of those things up front, and it ended up not being very useful. So how do we encourage this sort of optionality that is actually likely to be cheaper in the long run, even if we have to sit with some uncertainty over two systems that are potentially duplicative, but one which might end up being very successful?
So let's talk about this moment in time, especially after today. It feels kind of invigorating, right? Like we had industry, government, capital all at the table today. What do you think about this moment in time? Are we doing it right? Are we prepared to turn a corner? Do you think we're heading in the right direction? Are we addressing things how we should to kind of revitalize our industrial base and better prepare ourselves from a supply chain and national security perspective?
It's interesting. I think we have a lot of the right people in place. We've really identified the severity of the problem. There's still so much to do on the act side, and we shouldn't take our foot off the gas. And, there's small examples like Steven Feinberg, DepSecDef coming in and getting the MP materials deal done like right away in months. Like that's great. That's the sort of decisive action we need. It doesn't totally solve our rare earths problem, but there was a clear gap. And now that, that small gap is being addressed. So more specific targeted action like that really just gets after our key vulnerabilities. But then there was an executive order from last year. This is going to get a little bit nerdy, but I hope I'm able to emphasize why the point matters. So if you believe that military industrial capacity is downstream of our broader commercial manufacturing, the implication is that commercial technology is a national imperative. It's not a nice to have. It's not like, we should throw these annoying VC-backed companies a couple of contracts so that they shut up and then let us give the real work to the defense primes that have been building things for decades. So it actually matters because we will never be able to hit the production numbers that we need. And in peacetime, you don't want to have to be producing at wartime levels. It's very expensive, both politically, and then it's literally expensive to have to maintain wartime production during peacetime. If you have a more flexible commercial manufacturing base, now you can actually surge during wartime. So the executive order last year was looking to give some teeth to the existing laws that require defense technology to be procured commercially when it meets an agency's requirements or that agency can change their requirements. And the way it was going to give teeth was to pretty much have every acquisition need to be explicitly approved by the DoW if it was not going to use commercial. So the results came out about 2 weeks ago, and they're very grim. What it showed was of the tens of thousands of active procurements, over 60% were non-commercial, and 99% of those were allowed to just proceed. So it was essentially just like a rubber stamping exercise. And to understand how this happens, there are 160,000 acquisitions personnel in the Department of War. That's about the size of active duty U.S. Marine Corps. I'm sure these people are all good and hardworking, but the way that they've always done it is just to buy bespoke non-commercial technology, and it's going to take an enormous push for us really start to see real commercial technology. And the numbers should be closer to like 10 or 15% is what we can reasonably expect to be non-commercial. You have your fighters, your jets. Some of these things are obviously defense specific, but the subsystems, the electronics, the sensors, the software, that really should be commercial, and we should be really focused on making those things commercial. And that's not just VC-backed companies that benefit from that. That's companies all across America that have the capability to build commercial. And if we want to have that broader unlock there, it can start with defense, and then hopefully they find a much broader market in the commercial economy.
So you spend your day, obviously not just writing books, but working at Palantir, and Palantir's been at the forefront of kind of disrupting some of this and actually challenging some of these processes. Maybe talk a little bit about the growth of Palantir over the last 20 years and kind of some of the disruption that the organization has tried to put in place to disrupt some of these issues and how it's been done.
Yeah, I've been at Palantir for 6 years, but gotten to learn a lot about the history during the time there. And it's definitely been a team effort with other players in the ecosystem. But Palantir and SpaceX both sued the government around the same time in 2016 to get the government to enforce the laws about commerciality. And both us and SpaceX were actually just suing for the right to compete. So it wasn't like we lost our contract. We actually think we should have won, but it was we were excluded from this contract because we had a commercial product and the department wanted to build something bespoke when they should have been looking to commercial companies. So it's been that was I don't know if watershed's the right word, but it helps bring some momentum, and it's been an extremely long process. But also, when we became a public company, we started to be much more offensive in our communications. This book is part of that. Our CEO's book is part of that. But before we were public, we were pretty quiet, and so it was hard because people projected their image of themselves onto Palantir. But now you see a lot of defense companies or just general, kind of good for America companies being much more active in their communications, which I think is a very good sign because we want people to know what they're signing up for, and then painting that positive vision of America. And the optimism vision matters when you look at even something like AI data centers. If you can't convince the average American that AI is good for you, and you hear some of the CEOs of these AI companies and they're talking about how it's going to eliminate all jobs, why do you want to be working in AI? So one of the things we're working on at Palantir is telling the story of how AI is impactful for kind of every category of worker you can imagine, but especially blue collar workers right now.
Incredible. When we get back to scale and speed to market and the ability to actually meet the demand and challenges around supply chain, national security, one of my other favorite books was Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China. I don't know if you read that book, but it just kind of does a deep dive into the staggering competition we face with China. And he makes reference to the US CHIPS Act, right? So it was a $50 billion investment over 4 years, at the time, a revolutionary investment into chips manufacturing for the United States. Apple itself invests, I think, 50 billion a year over 10 years in manufacturing in China. How are the odds even stacked that we can even compete and scale?
Right. Yeah, I think that book is very important because a lot of Americans, myself included, kind of have the impression that Apple just outsourced to China and they had all the industry there. And really, they helped build up the industry in China and spent the
Millions of
equivalent of like
employees,
two
yeah.
Marshall Plans in China. And so, what if they had invested that in the U.S. and if there had been their alignment there from the government rather than being kind of a passive actor in America's future to be a little more active in the future and not just be muddling through. I'm sorry, I kind of forgot the question.
Just about the ability. Like, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to actually scale?
Oh, yeah.
Right. I know, like, because of that
I
exact
think
point.
the things
Like,
that we have going for us, we are the leader in AI. There is a lot of IP theft and espionage that's happening from China, and I think our current government is watching that very closely. But that's certainly a threat to the billions of dollars that have gone into training these frontier models. But we're the leader in AI, and as Shyam, who I wrote the book with, kind of likes to say, AI wasn't on China's roadmap, and so they are planners. We traditionally have not been good at planning, but we are able to be innovative and respond to conditions as they change in a pretty dynamic way. And I think that's a credible reason for why we're leading in AI. On the defense side, we in some ways have benefited from having actual active conflicts in the last few decades, from Iran to global war on terror. Like, we actually have the data of targeting and fighting, and China has not been in a fight since like 1979 when they invaded Vietnam. So some of that is very important data for our military, but we're lacking the connection from factory floor to foxhole. So what does the manufacturing side visibility look like? And we haven't treated that as imperative because it's not kinetic, it doesn't go boom, but clearly it's really important. So that's where we need to be focusing right now.
So when we caught up last week in preparation for this, I shared a little bit about I spend my time traveling the country, helping manufacturing companies figure out where to site plants. So much of that is blue collar workers. Who's going to actually be in a position to fill these factories, create these jobs? It's really the rubber hitting the road. We can't do this manufacturing without real estate and physical sites and talent. Talk a little bit about what you see as kind of roadblocks or opportunities to training a future workforce, getting folks around the country bought in on this kind of larger need for revitalization of the industrial base more broadly, right? Like, this isn't something where it's an investment that exists in California and New York and Austin, right? This is in America, all hands on deck. We need talented people around the country stepping up and building again all kinds of products.
Here, the fact that we're a leader in AI should be very encouraging because the overlap between AI and manufacturing, there's incredible opportunities there to not just modernize, but really revolutionize the way that some of these factories operate. We are working with demographic challenges of an aging manufacturing workforce. But again, that creates opportunity where how do we use software to establish continuity as these factories either change hands to, literally the descendants of the people that are retiring or to other kind of owners and operators. And there's a huge demand for those jobs. So I think the trends on building the physical world are really good. And right now there's challenges to traditional white collar jobs as people are grappling with the future of software given AI coding agents and how different that role looks. But we know that we are going to need a ton of human capital to produce the things we want to produce. As nuclear becomes, a bigger deal on this front and center, like that requires a lot of people. What are our plans for space and beyond? All of that requires human capital, maybe with robots, but certainly with humans too.
Yeah. Well, Madeline's book is fantastic. I encourage everybody to read it. But one of my favorite sections here is kind of toward the end. And you have a quote here. I just wanted to get your reaction and maybe you could expand on it. Is this reference about our advantages? So perhaps our most significant advantage, we humbly submit, is that we're crazy. As a democratic power, we don't do long-term planning or strategy very well, but we do empower crazy innovations. We can pivot on a dime. And if you punch us in the face, there's no telling what we might do. That's America. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that can be understood through any of these examples in history. Andrew Higgins is probably a good one. So the Higgins boat and Higgins, his company built over 90% of all the vessels that were used in World War II. He initially built shallow draft boats for bootleggers, and he was from Louisiana. And so he would sell his boats to these bootleggers, then he would turn around and sell them to the Coast Guard and to catch the bootleggers. And then World War II, starts heating up, and he's been trying to sell to the Navy for so long. And the Navy first tries to copy his ships. Well, first they exclude him from the competition. Then they try to copy his ships, which they're not really able to do. And then finally, President Truman, then Senator Truman comes in and is like, you guys have been acting crazy and mistreating this company. Like, look what they've built. It's way better. And so you have to buy these ships. And then kind of the rest is history in terms of how many he's able to produce. But that's a good example of when we absolutely have to do the right thing. We do, but it took longer than it should have. But those are the types of innovators, the Higgins archetype, that certainly still exist today. And we can't let kind of our bureaucracy and process quash them.
Excellent. Well, look, as we close out, I'd just love to get your kind of thoughts on a call to action. We really like to kind of wrap things up on Coffee with Ken with kind of, what is your message to the public sector, private sector, and maybe even to educators around the country? What do those three buckets need to do to kind of help us further mobilize?
I would say keep ambitions and standards very high. There's a lot of momentum from both political parties, all political parties, on the importance of this issue. And there's really something for everyone in terms of the stake that we have in the future, whether you are a builder, you're on the policy side, you are uniformed, and we need heretics who are willing to hopefully not have to sacrifice their career, but maybe be prepared to put their career on the line to have a much greater impact, which is traditionally what we've had to do to really get things done. So I think keep being ambitious and don't stop until we have serious results on the manufacturing side.
And look, we were ambitious today. We put you through like 1,900 panels. We've had you here since 8 a.m. Madeline Hart, thank you so much for being here. Thank all of you for being here for our first Coffee with Ken Summit. We're so grateful. Thank you for closing us out, Madeline.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.